All right, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to this presentation from CSA. My name is Lefteris Koutaris. I am a research analyst and program manager for the Cloud Control Matrix working group. And on the other end is my colleague, Eric Johnson. Eric, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a few words about the presentation we are having today?
Yes, thank you, Lefteris. I'm also a senior research analyst with the CSA. I was previously with the U.S. Central Bank and before that with the World Bank. We did a lot of work implementing high-risk, high-security systems, and most recently in the cloud space and working with FedRAMP Cloud Services, where I got a fair amount of experience with the shared security responsibility model, where FedRAMP Cloud Service providers do a pretty good job of describing to their customers what their responsibilities are. And back before I joined the CSA, I worked with Lefteris as a volunteer on the projects implementing these enhancements to the CCM and CAIQ.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. So let's move on to the presentation. So as you can see in the agenda, how this presentation is organized is that I'm going to give a quick overview to the Cloud Control Matrix for those that are not that much familiar with the standard. Then we're going to provide some quick overview on what is the SaaS security responsibility model, very briefly, and we will move on to our third section, which we will describe to the group how the Cloud Control Matrix facilitates the integration of SSRM related guidelines or controls, and then we will conclude the presentation. Oops, this way. Okay, so let's get right to it and begin with the first section, which is the introduction of the CCM, right? So what is the Cloud Control Matrix? So the Cloud Control Matrix, it is a cloud security framework. It is specifically designed and developed from the industry to the industry for the industry to aid cloud organizations to manage risk in the cloud. Right? So it offers a set of well defined security domains and underlying control specifications, with an objective there is to simplify cloud organizations' approach towards those controls of proper implementation, their assessment, and finally meet compliance and achieve that across all different types of clouds, right? So in addition to the control specifications, the CCM, with additional works with the CCM in order to align that with other global regulation and standards. We achieve that via the mapping activities that we conduct with the working group. And also the CCM provides guidance for the applicability of the controls per each of the cloud service models. And finally, facilitates the integration, as we spoke in the introduction. It's the subject of this presentation, right? The SSRM requirements and guidance to help both parties, service providers and customers, to delineate the security controls, ownership, and their implementation responsibility. Last but not least, the Cloud Control Matrix is the backbone of Cloud Security Alliance STAR program and its 3 different types levels of assessment. So here's an overview of the CCM at version 4, the latest version. You can see the security domain structure. So the version 4, it is the successor of its previous version 3.0.1 of the CCM. The objective in the development was to introduce new additional controls in the standard in order to better reflect the changes that took place in the meantime and evolution of the cloud security landscape, both in terms of the new technologies that were introduced as well as to the legal and regulatory environment. As you can see, the V4 is comprised of a total of 17 security domains and a total of 197 control specifications. In addition, as we mentioned to the controls, it provides additional guidance with 3 different components or matrices. As you can see on the right, so the controls, SSRM, ownership and applicability matrix. Eric will be providing more info on that shortly, later on in the presentation. And we have 2 other columns which link the actual controls implementation to the cloud stack components. So there is an architectural linkage there of the controls to the cloud. And the organizational relevance of the controls, meaning that what are the expected teams that would manage the controls per each one of the CCM domains. All right, so the control specifications of the CCM are complemented, as you can see, with several other components, which all together form the CCM framework. These components are useful for cloud organizations to consider for both their implementation and compliance programs. Right, so let's mention a few very briefly. So the first is the controls applicability matrix, right? So this component helps organizations understand what is the applicability, and SSRM, as mentioned, implementation responsibility of the controls per each one of the cloud service models, CS, PaaS, and SaaS. The implementation and auditing guidelines, which are supplementary components as well to the core controls, and aim to provide guidance on how a cloud organization should approach the properly the implementation and assessment respectively of the control specifications in the CCM. The Consensus Assessment Initiative Questionnaire, or CAIQ V4, which is a very useful tool that cloud customers can include into their services procurement plans. And with that done, it's a very useful so that they can gather accurate information about the security practices of the CSPs and the cloud services that are considered, right? And another also important component to the CCM, linking it back to the alignment that we spoke earlier on, it's the mapping activities that we conduct to align the controls of the standard to other frameworks. We conduct that, and we produce alongside the mappings also a gap analysis and addendum for those controls, right? So essentially, what we want to convey to organizations with that comparison of the CCM to other standards is what are the overlaps of requirements between the CCM and those standards, and what are the differences as well, right? So what is the additional step that organizations have to make in order to meet those differences and meet compliance also to the CCM? So let's have a first introduction into the security responsibility model and use a simple example to understand it better. So if you have been operating in the cloud, you might be thinking where the service provider responsibility ends and where the cloud service customer responsibility begins, right? So in what aspects of security as a cloud customer I would be responsible of, right? So this line of demarcation, as one would expect, is different depending on the type of the provider and the cloud service representation. So So by this slide, we thought to use a simple analogy of that of eating a pizza to describe the SSRM in relation to the cloud service models, and to some extent and at a very high level approach that line of demarcation as a first level, right, of understanding the SSRM. So based on this analogy, there are plenty of options on how you could, you could eat a pizza, and you would need to select, the one that best fits your needs. So you could either make a pizza at home, you could order it from your favorite delivery place, or you could go sit down at a restaurant and have it, right? So if we take this analogy and map it to the cloud service models, then we would have an analogy to the traditional on-premises world, which is like, making the pizza at your home. So in that case, you have to buy all the ingredients yourself, put them together. You have to use your own appliances, and then you need to bake it, serve the table, and eat the pizza, right? When using infrastructure as a service, right, the analogy would be that, that the base layer of the pizza is already done for you. Right, you only need to bake it, prepare the table, and eat it, and then with PaaS there are even more decisions that are made for you. And finally, when you get to the SaaS, it seems like almost everything is done for you. However, there is a catch there that you still have a responsibility to eat safely, right? So the restaurant in this case, like the IaaS provider, is not responsible if you choke on your food, right? So in the SaaS world, that would largely come down to to properly managing access control in that layer and applications configurations, for instance. Of course, in the world of cloud computing, things get a bit more complex than eating pizza, but what is important for you as a cloud customer to understand is that what the cloud service that your purchasing provides, and what are your security responsibilities for securing that service and the underlying infrastructure, and in many cases also jointly with the provider of that service. So as a general rule of thumb, it is useful to have in mind that the service provider, for instance, here we take into account an IaaS provider, right, is responsible for managing the security of the cloud, while the customer, which in this case could be a SaaS provider, a SaaS customer, or a customer to a SaaS provider, would be responsible for securing what is in the cloud. So in the former case, depending on the service model, which could be an IaaS or PaaS, this comes down to securing the physical infrastructure and up to the virtualization layer, namely the hypervisor. And if you're purchasing, if a cloud customer purchases also the PaaS, so that would involve also the virtual machines and the operating system security, right? So in the latter case, with the customer is typically responsible for implementing security controls that are related to data security, because the customer is the entity that injects their data into the cloud, right? They have to deal with identity and access management, with secure software development, configuration management, etc. So while this is while certain responsibilities, as we mentioned, are typically and exclusively owned by one of the two parties, there are cases, which Eric would mention, that would be mostly on the organizational level, controls level, where there is a shared responsibility between both parties. That's in the case of audits, for instance, or verifying compliance requirements to laws and regulations, trainings, incident responses, exercise, to name a few, right? Where both parties are required to implement those in a shared context. So in all of these cases, it is best for the customers to reach out to the providers to have those demarcation lines better explained and clarified. And the best way to do that is by sharing with those providers, as we call the CAIQ questionnaire, which Eric will also present shortly and provide more details, right? Which, by the way, also helps organizations close the readiness gaps, which is the readiness gap, which is often observed when they are migrating to the cloud. So that's all from me as a basic overview to the SSRM. So I'm handing over to Eric to continue on the SSRM CCM integration part. Eric.
Thank you, Lefteris. So yeah, I really like that pizza as a service analogy. It's very illustrative in terms of how the SSRM works. Here's a sort of version of that translates it into more the technical domains, where with the on-prem environment, we basically do everything yourself. And with IaaS, the CSP's responsibility generally stops at the hypervisor. PaaS services, of course, there's a wide variety there, from everything from virtual machines to containers to serverless, etc. So there's some variation in the PaaS space in terms of the SSRM, and then of course the CSP is responsible for the most in security aspects and controls in the SaaS environment. Okay. Next slide. So in terms of the things we added into the CCM framework for CCM version 4 for the SSRM, it's a pretty comprehensive set, actually. It sort of elevates the CCM into the domain of similar to FedRAMP, and we sort of modeled it after that in terms of being the only other mature cloud security program that has comprehensive controls and a repeatable process and framework for helping CSPs and their customers understand and implement the shared security responsibility model on a per control basis. Okay, and the way they do that is that the CSP will delineate the security responsibility or ownership for each control and provide customer control implementation guidance using the CAIQ questionnaire. So that's something that customers can definitely leverage in their procurement process and evaluating CSPs. How good a job did they do in terms of describing the customer responsibilities? And then once you've made your selection, you can leverage that to help implement it as well. And we've, in the CCM, we put typical control ownership and responsibility guidance, although it does tend to vary somewhat from one CSP to the next, depending on how they implement things, what services they make available, and that sort of thing. But that provides sort of a baseline that the CSPs can use to develop specific guidance for their services in the CAIQ. And then those are published and readily available in the STAR registry. So it makes it easy for current and prospective customers to go out there and download the CAIQ and check the SSRM information there. All right, next slide. So this slide shows the particular controls, and specifically they're in the STA family, supply chain management, transparency, and accountability controls 1 through 6, because the shared security responsibility model does apply over the entire life cycle of a service. So rather than having one sort of really large control, we broke it into 6 individual controls. It starts with some sort of general organizational ones about how the organization should have a policy and procedures for implementing, executing, managing the SSRM across their supply chain. And then the next one talks about actually doing it. And STA03 is important for the cloud service providers. It requires them to actually, since it's their service, they're the ones that are implementing it, they're making the first cut at delineating the SSRM in implementing their service in terms of what they decide to provide for customers, what controls, what capabilities, what sort of configuration buttons and levers they provide for their customers. So it really starts with them, and the whole life cycle really does require for the CSPs to provide that first cut at what is the control ownership and what is the customer security implementation guidance. So that is the first step, and that's what STA03 requires. Then STA04 gets into how it's executed over the life cycle. Okay, that the CSP provides that initial baseline ownership and guidance, and then the customers then need to go through and validate that. When you make decisions about how you're going to architect your environment, say what identity and access management services you're going to use, are you going to use cloud identities or some federated service or an identity as a service? Those type of decisions can impact how you actually execute the shared security responsibility model. And then the next controls talk about managing it over the life cycle as well. So it's not just implementing, executing, operating the service, but then also from an audit perspective, each party is responsible for auditing or assessing the portions of the security controls that they're responsible for in whole or in part. So the SSRM actually applies all the way through the the audit and assessment cycle as well. So there's a pretty comprehensive set of controls there with some extensive guidance there. And we also added additional elaboration in the CCM guidelines document. And there's some content in the main CSA security guidance document that's currently being updated. We're going to be enhancing the SSRM guidance there as well. Next slide. So this one shows the typical control, applicability, and ownership columns that we added to CCM. So for IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, is this control typically shared, CSP owned, customer owned, or what have you? And that's described for all the controls, all 197 controls in the matrix. And that gives you sort of an initial feel. But again, the more detailed, more precise delineation you will find in the CAIQ matrix, which is the next slide. Or a couple of slides down. In the CAIQ matrix, where the CSPs delineate control ownership, they describe the portion they implement and then the portion that the customer needs to implement. Now, the CAIQ is structured where some controls, since they're more comprehensive or have a number of elements, the CAIQ has a few more questions than there are controls in the CCM, because some controls are broken out into multiple questions. And so therefore the SSRM information is also broken down in that manner. So the first thing the CAIQ does is, does the CSP meet this control, yes or no, right? And then it says, is it CSP owned, we meet it fully, or is it, we don't meet it at all, it's customer owned, or is it shared, right? And so in customer owned, it could be something that they outsource to a third party. So that accounts for the use case where you have a SaaS provider that might be might be leveraging a supporting IaaS or PaaS provider for their environment. So they might outsource, say, the data center controls, which is fine. So it gives you that visibility into the full stack, excuse me, of who's implementing what for your applications, which is important to be aware of from a third-party risk management perspective. And then the most important shared controls are between the CSP and the customer, because when the customer, want to understand the ones that you're responsible for in part, that's, those are the ones. And then the ones that are shared between the CSP and third party, that means it's partially outsourced to a supporting service provider, which is, again, good to know from a third party risk management perspective. And then there's two additional columns, which are optional but very important, where the CSP describes how they implement the portion of the control they're responsible for. And then this is the most important one from you, the perspective of you, the customer, understanding what your responsibilities are, or at least understanding the CSP's guidance for that. Like I mentioned earlier, you may decide to, change or tailor that a little bit, and based on your environment, your decisions about what services you're implementing, how you're architecting your environment, that sort of thing. But that's a very important sort of first step of the initial guidance in the SSRM. And in my recommendation to organizations I worked with and our internal customers was that you should be looking for this information during the procurement process to see how good the SSRM information is that your prospective CSPs are offering, and use that to evaluate against it. Because if you look at guidance from and reports from folks like, Gartner and PwC and others that have analyzed major cloud security breaches, they all say that the vast majority of those are actually the customer's fault for failing to properly implement and execute their portion of the SSRM. So my guidance has always been that, this is the single most important cloud security concept. And if you want to, you should really make a point of doing a good job with that if you want to, make sure you stay off the front page of the newspaper, that kind of thing. So it starts with, during the evaluation phase of, checking how good the CSP that you're looking at, how good a job they do with documenting and make that information available to you as a customer. I've seen environments where they've provided no information and the customers had to figure it out for themselves. And those were some of the very hardest services to implement and get authorized by, to get the execs to sign off on going live, because there were a lot of unknowns. So it all starts with that, those first steps when you're making the selection. Okay, next slide. So as we mentioned, the SSRM delineation, it varies by service type and by service provider, particularly for technical controls based on, the services they offer, what they implement. And it is really important to understand what the CSP does for you and what they're leaving in your hands, what you're accountable for. As I mentioned, if lack of clear understanding or lack of rigorous execution of SSRM responsibilities can have significant implications. You can end up from misconfigured cloud services to unsecured APIs to a whole variety of other potential things that could result in data loss or security breaches, and some of which, as we know, can be high visibility and very, very expensive. So we recommend that folks check the CAIQ questionnaire in the STAR registry, as I mentioned, to see what information their CSPs have provided. And if they haven't provided the SSRM info, circle back with them and say, are you completing this? Could you please complete one for us so that we can understand what the SSRM is? And if not, my recommendation would be you should seriously consider, do you want to do business with that CSP if they're not telling you what you need to know to operate it securely. Now, I mentioned this earlier too, that it's the customer's responsibility to not just take what the CSP tells you sort of verbatim as gospel, but you need to validate it, make it your own. You need to tailor it based on your architectural decisions, what CSP services you are or are not implementing, particularly with the hyperscalers, where they have, dozens, if not hundreds of different services that you pick and choose from. And some of them are so large, you could never implement them all in your first release to begin with, right? So you do need to tailor it and refine it based on those considerations and your own priorities as well. And to be honest, in all the ones I've worked on, I've never seen a CSP get it 100% right. I've seen, particularly like simple example of some of the organizational controls, I've seen CSPs saying things like personnel screening and security awareness training are CSP owned. And we're like, no, they're not. You screen and train your people, we screen and train ours, right? So you do need to sort of validate it, and then, and work with your CSPs, because nobody's perfect, and give them that feedback so that they can improve it in the next release and that sort of thing. And we do have a lot of work going on within the CSA and plan for the coming year to enhance the guidance and support we provide for the SSRM. As I mentioned, the updates in the works for CCM guidance V5 document. And then Lefteris has a couple of projects going on as well that he's going to describe.
Thanks, Eric. A quick note on the previous discussion on the CAIQ. So we get often from customers questions which are implementation specific. about how a certain system control is to be implemented by by a service provider, and if there is or not a responsibility between the two. And the replies we give back, it is that currently, as the key questions are formulated, are pretty much high level, right? So the questions in the CAIQ are directly derived from the CCM controls, which are vendor agnostic and technology agnostic, right? So in that case, the service provider can go ahead and reply to the question also at a very high level way, right? So coming back to the discussion and to the description that Eric was giving, right? It is that it's very important for service providers to provide that input into those cells about how they approach the implementation of a given question, right? So these are very two important cells, which are currently optional and recommended in the consensus assessment initiative question, right? So as Eric said, I mean, this is the place where cloud service customers should insist with a service provider to get that implementation description of the controls, looking at it also from the standpoint of the SaaS security responsibility model. So I think that's a very important aspect to mention. Now coming back to what Eric said, so we are planning as CSA, Cloud Security Alliance, and the System Working Group to kick off a project to develop SSRM guidelines for the full stack of the system controls, all 197 controlled in the CCM. So the decision that came after consulting our community network of partners and members, and based on the feedback we received, it was it was made apparent that there is a lot of confusion among the customers on who's responsible for what security functions in the cloud, which is the case as a general statistical trend, I would say, but at the same time, this is the case when it comes to the actual controls in the CCM and how the cloud customer should approach the implementation responsibility for the specific system controls in the standard, right? So the primary objective of the project, of course, is to develop the guidelines for the controls, but there is also a secondary objective, which is also to educate cloud customers and how they how themselves and their service providers share the responsibility for securing their cloud footprint. So just a quick update. So the project it's still at an early stage. It is expected to be completed later within Q4 this year. So you are welcome to join and to contribute to that. So there's pretty much much of time there to have some additional contributions. And that will take us to the last slide. So thank you. Thank you all. Hope you enjoyed the presentation. That will be all in a nutshell. As I mentioned, please reach out to our support team. There's the email there, or to Eric and myself in case you have any questions on the SaaS security responsibility models, all in the projects we are both working on. So wish you a nice day and stay safe.
Thank you all very much.